everyone. Good morning. Well done, can I just say, on choosing the greatest and best possible way to spend your Sunday morning. It's wonderful to see so many of you doing so, not just in being at the one-of-a-kind, sort of surreal literature festival that is Cliveden, but also coming to hear from one of our greatest storytellers. My name's Hannah McInnes. I'm absolutely delighted to have this chance to delve into Gabriel's Moon, which is the riveting thriller that has inspired this event. But you might have noticed that the event has been titled The World of William Boyd. So we'll also be delving into that world, which, as I'm sure many of you know, is quite some world. He's written, we've just been debating quite how many it is, but we're going to say 17 novels, 5 short story collections, 20 screenplays. Any Human Heart, as I'm sure many of you have adored, there we go, was nominated for a Booker and also made into a fantastic TV series. So I'm not going to say any more because you've really come to hear from William. William, welcome.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Delighted to be here. Welcome to my world.
Yes. So before your world, could you just set the scene on Gabriel's world and the scene of Gabriel's Moon?
Yeah, so Gabriel Dax is a young travel writer. And the setting is London initially, and it's early 1960s, so we're in the middle of the Cold War. And I won't spoil it any further, but he gets inveigled into becoming a kind of bagman for MI6, and everything goes wrong thereafter. So he's a reluctant spy, but I've always thought that travel writing would be a very good cover for a spy. And so I decided, and I'm pretty sure that certain travel writers are or were spies as well. But it's you can go anywhere and nobody suspects you because you're sort of writing a book. So that's why I made him a travel writer, but he does become a fully fledged spy by the end.
What is it about spy novels then? Because you're not a stranger to spy novels, and you mentioned this idea that you thought travel writers, is it because you love the genre? Is it because you secretly would like to have been a spy or are a spy?
No, I'm very interested in spies and spying because for various reasons. I mean, I first started investigating the world of spying and espionage in Any Human Heart, in fact. And I don't know if any of you remember, but Logan Mountstuart, the protagonist, is recruited by Ian Fleming, no less, to work for naval intelligence. And he's parachuted into Switzerland and is arrested 24 hours later. So he's a very unsuccessful spy. But in the course of my researches, I became very intrigued by the notorious Cambridge Five, and particularly Kim Philby, the super spy, according to the Russians. A most extraordinary life. He was a double agent for 23 years and finally defected back to Russia. But what intrigued me was how did he maintain that double life for so long? Most double agents crack up or become alcoholics or get discovered, but Philby somehow bluffed his way through 23 years of spying for the Soviet Union and didn't crack up. And so I asked myself, what price do you pay as a spy? What happens to you? And I think you get dehumanized in a way because you can't trust anybody. And this led on to my novel Restless, which was a proper spy novel as well, World War II. And it investigates that very question, you know, what do you lose by becoming a spy? And you can't exist in the world if you don't trust people. Even, you know, getting the right change in a pub, you know, you have to trust the barman. I wanted to investigate what that price was that you paid, and consequently became very interested in the whole world of spies and spying. And I also think that novelists look at the world the way spies do. The spy will notice that the same car has been parked outside his flat for 3 days, and the novelist will notice that his next-door neighbor has lost a lot of weight. So that sort of forensic gaze on the world is what the novelist has, but the spy has that gaze in order to protect him or herself. But there's a very similar kind of look, I think, about the two professions.
I mean, To that end then, how much would you say of yourself there is in Gabriel Dax, if any at all, and generally when you're writing, how much you put yourself into a character like that?
Well, I would say very little, actually, apart from the fact that he's a writer. And I'm not an autobiographical writer at all, actually. I've written autobiography or pieces about my life, but I don't consciously put my circle or my experiences into my novels. I prefer to let my imagination do the work, and it frees me as a writer, I think, to be non-autobiographical, because I can write about absolutely anything. And if my imagination is functioning well, then I can be a woman for the duration of a novel, or I can kill people. I can go over the top in World War I. That sort of experience is an imaginary experience, obviously, but it's a liberation that I find very attracting, and I don't particularly want to write about myself. Actually, kind of boring, I think. So I'm always looking for stories that, in a way, challenge me and challenge my imagination. And Gabriel's Moon is a case in point. I mean, I'm a writer, but I'm not a spy. I've never worked for MI6. And I've never done a lot of the things that Gabriel does in this book.
I want to come to your brilliant imagination in a moment, and how you kind of weave it in and out with a lot of reality, as well as you do in lots of your books. But it is interesting, you just said that you let your imagination run free. You could be a woman, you can be whoever you want to be in your books. And some people sort of ask whether authors should be allowed to be whoever they want to be. For example, whether you should be able to write a woman, or whether you should leave that to women. And I wonder your thoughts on that notion.
Yes, it's called appropriation. It's a sin. And I'm a sinner, I'm afraid. No, I think that I understand what people are saying when they say you are not qualified, or you shouldn't be allowed to write about this subject or that kind of person. But I totally disagree. I think as a serious novelist, you should be free to write about absolutely anything you want. But there is a proviso that if you do decide, as I've done on 4 occasions, to write from the point of view of a woman, the judgment that ensues will be very severe and very sort of nitpicking. So you have to get it right. And if you know that as a writer, then you are still absolutely at liberty to write about anything from any point of view, I think, but be prepared for the judgment to arrive. And if you can cope with that, then fair enough.
Particularly because I understand that the first judgment for you always comes from the same woman.
Indeed, lucky me. My wife, Susan, she's a very honest person, and quite blunt sometimes. But I think every writer needs that first reader who they absolutely trust. It might be your agent, it might be your editor, it might be a friend, but in my case it's my wife, and she's gives me very good advice, and I always listen to what she says, and usually I take her advice. And because she's not, as it were, frightened or in awe of me or anything like that, she can say things like, "Is chapter 13 meant to be funny?" And I say, "Yes, of course it is." well, I'm going to disappoint you, it's a very, very valuable process, and it means that when I hand in my book, I'm not really expecting it to be edited, because it's already been edited to a certain extent. But of course it is edited, and it goes through the usual mill of publishing. But I submit the book with confidence, because I've had this gimlet eye read it.
Cruel but kind, is it meant to be funny? Talking about sort of being able to be whoever you want to be in terms of being a novelist, novels, as I introduced you, I said you've written 18 of them, 17, depends whether we count one we'll talk about later. But what is it about that as a form that you love so much? And you clearly love it because you come back to it again and again, the novel form.
Well, I think we're all on this curious adventure, the life we lead. And I think the art form that does the human condition best is the novel. Because people are mysterious, people are opaque. Even people really close to you, you can't tell what they're thinking or what they're feeling And even if they tell you what they're thinking and feeling, they may be lying. But if you want to know what's going on inside other people's heads, the interior life of your fellow human beings, then my advice is read a novel, because there it's absolutely guaranteed to be true. We know what Elizabeth Bennet thinks of Mr. Darcy, because Jane Austen guarantees that it's absolutely what you wanted to write. So, but this paradox that fiction, something made up, actually opens the door to understanding our lives and our human interactions in a way that's better, I believe. Playwrights and filmmakers would disagree, perhaps poets as well, but I think the novel, because it is a loose, baggy monster, can contain anything, really does the job of explaining, as I say, this curious adventure we're all on.
But you also enjoy so much writing the screenplays as well, even though I suppose you would say, and I've heard you say, that the parameters are so much tighter, you lose so much. But when you're writing your novels, are you thinking, oh, this might turn into, it's very cinematic, this might turn into a film, it might hit the screen, and perhaps so-and-so will play Gabriel Dax?
Well, no, because I'd end up writing a 60-page novel, because I have this theory. I've written a lot of films. I've directed a feature film. I've produced films. But I'm very aware, because I have the day job of a novelist, that film, this sounds very banal, is photography. And there is only one point of view, the camera lens. So you're always on the outside looking on. There are ways and means of trying to break that, tyranny of objectivity with voiceover or using the camera as point of view, but they're crude tools in comparison to what you can do in the novel. So film is, I love film. I've always wanted to write films, but I'm very aware, because I do both, of the limitations and the impossibilities of what film can do. I mean, it's impossible to replicate the nuances of one paragraph of a novel on film, and even with the best actor in the world. Everything is simpler and everything is objective. But subjectivity is meat and drink to the novel. You could write a novel about our sessions today if you wanted. But you couldn't make a film out of it. It's a wonderful liberation to have the novel at my disposal, and I moonlight in the world of cinema with great pleasure. But I'm under no illusions that what I'm doing is it's another art form, but it's not nearly as capacious as the novel.
In that capacious, like the way the novel is, allows you to have so much detail, as you've just said. What about also the balance? It's really interesting. You have a lot of detail, so much. You take us into the world. We eat with Gabriel. We walk the streets around the world with him. But how do you get that balance right? At one point, he says to his psychiatrist, he realizes that to say nothing is far more eloquent. And I just wonder, as a novelist, how you get that balance between taking us into a world with the detail, but not telling us too much, loading us with it.
Yeah, I think it's instinct in a way. There are novelists who over-describe. Raymond Chandler, for example, pages of descriptions of the interiors of hotel rooms and so on. So I think it's a question of your own sense of what will work. But in my case, I'm a realistic novelist, and I want the world of my novels to seem as real and as palpable and as textured as the world we live in. And so the kind of detail you put in a novel is all towards this end. And sometimes it's to do with what somebody's eating or what they're wearing.
Whether they've had a haircut.
Whether they had a haircut. But it's just to make the world seem as real as possible, so that almost, and this is another thing I do a lot, is you begin to forget you're reading a novel and think you're reading about something that actually happened. And that's why I write these, what I call whole life novels, cradle to grave novels, where the central character, usually leads a very long life, and I detail it in such a way that you might actually think that there was somebody called Logan Mountstuart who lived from 1906 to 1992. And I'm happy with that slight uncertainty that I provoke in the mind of the readers.
The reason also that you provoke that uncertainty is because you interweave your fictional characters with real life events, and particularly in this book, so much that's going on in the history of the 1960s is real people, real events. Why is that important to you? What adventure do you want to take us on or make us work harder to?
It's the same motivation. I mean, in the beginning of the novel, Gabriel has been sent to Congo to write a travel piece about Brazzaville and Leopoldville, these two capitals that are separated by the Congo River. But while he's there, he gets a chance to interview the new Prime Minister of the Congo, Patrice Lumumba, who is a real person. So my fictional character interviews a real African politician, who then 6 weeks later is brutally murdered by a combination of Belgian, British, and American secret agencies. And that, in a way, sets the whole ball of the novel rolling. Obviously, Gabriel Dax didn't interview Patrice Lumumba, but it gives the book, again, a kind of rootedness in a place and time and history that I want to emphasize. So all the detail is, in a way, to bring about that suspension of disbelief, to make you forget you're reading a novel, and to actually be caught up in the world of the book, as if you were reading a work of non-fiction.
I feel like it's a good time to segue into William's world, which is very relevant, talking about what you know and what you don't know, and sort of the world of what's real and what isn't, and you trying to confuse us. And I don't know if people know the story of the novel that I didn't know if it was your 17th or 18th, Nat Tate.
Yes, well, Nat Tate is a book I wrote. It's 80 pages long, so it's not really novel length, but it's provoked almost more furore than any novel I've ever written. So apologies if you've heard this story before, but I was working on an art magazine called Modern Painters, a very sort of serious quarterly, and was on the editorial board. We used to have these meetings once every quarter, and at one of these meetings, the editor said, "How do I get fiction into an art magazine?" So I said, "Why don't I invent a painter?" And she said, "On you go." So I did. And I invented this American abstract expressionist called Nat Tate, who committed suicide by jumping off the Staten Island ferry, and his body was never found. But before he died, he gathered together all his work and burnt it, with the exception of a few drawings, which is why you've never heard of him. Anyway, that was the plan. I wrote the little book, and I filled it with photographs as well. A lot of them were anonymous photographs that I found in junk shops and brocantes in France, and could actually physically flesh out or provide images of Nat's life. There's nothing like writing a caption under a photograph to make it seem genuine. So the book was done, and on the editorial board of Modern Painters was one David Bowie. Yes, that David Bowie. And we'd both joined the board at the same time, so we used to sit together at the board meetings. And David, as I called him, Bowie said, "Why don't we publish this as a book?" And he had a little publishing company, as one does, and he produced this little book, which is, I wish I had a copy of it, because it's an immaculate little monograph, very glossy paper, and in it are some images of the few surviving works of Nat's oeuvre that I did. And then Bowie had this idea, and this is, I think, the mischief about the man, of launching the book at a very lavish party in Manhattan. And he was friends with the artist Jeff Koons. I don't know if you know Jeff. And so he said to Jeff Koons, "Could I have a party in your enormous studio?" And Jeff Koons said yes. So we had this huge party. Bowie read extracts from the book, deadpan, and a journalist, British journalist, unprompted by us, went around the room asking people if they'd ever heard of Nat Tate. And of course, people being people, they said, yes, I remember. I remember that show in Philadelphia, and so on. And it was a very glittering party. There were lots of famous people there, because who wouldn't have say no to a David Bowie invitation? And this journalist, having done the room like this, wrote it up. It's the Independent newspaper. And banner headlines, British novelist fools Manhattan art world. Well, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but everybody loves a hoax. Everybody, particularly if you're hoaxing pretentious intellectuals. And it became a global event for 24 hours. Jeremy Paxman interviewed me on Newsnight, said, what terrible drawings. But it went on and on and on. And if it wasn't for Bowie, I don't think it would have survived. But his renown made it endlessly fascinating. And we've done, I think, 3 documentaries about Nat Tate. And because I produced the work, I said to myself, it was published in Germany, and I was sitting in a very cool art gallery with an audience like this talking about Nat Tate, and behind me on the wall was a huge 20-foot projection of the only photograph that exists of Nat Tate. And I was sitting there thinking, this is getting out of hand. I felt like Dr. Frankenstein with my monster behind me. I thought, how on earth how do I ram a stake through his heart, you know? So I thought, I know what I'll do. I'm going to do a Nat Tate. I'll sell it at auction. So fake artist, fake painting, real money. And that should put it to bed, I thought. And I had a friend who worked at Sotheby's, and Sotheby's very, very nobly took up the cause. And I produced this little drawing, size of a postcard. Nat Tate liked drawing bridges. So it was a drawing of a bridge, sort of semi-abstract. And it had 2 pages in Sotheby's catalogue, a little essay by me. Everybody knew by now that I produced the Nat Tates, but I gave it its provenance and all that sort of thing. And it was estimated its value was £3,000. Going to charity, not to the painter. We saw it was a very exciting auction, and it was quickly exceeded £3,000, went up and up and up, and eventually bought for £7,500. I couldn't believe it, and bought on the phone. So I said to the Sotheby's auctioneer, who bought it? Well, there aren't many Nat Tates out there, and I need to know who owns this one. And he said, I can't tell you, because it's, you know, it's sort of, it has to remain anonymous, but the person who bought the drawing allowed their name to be given to me. And it turned out to be somebody called Anthony McPartlin, Ant of Ant and Dec fame. So I completely failed to kill off Nat Tate, and so it goes. I realise that when I'm dead and gone, I'll be remembered for having created this fictional painter, and I wrote a few novels along the way. But it's a great story, and it was in we had that party in Manhattan on April Fool's Day, 1998. So it's been running for decades now, and I don't think it's ever going to go away.
Oh, a worthy detour, wouldn't you say, as far as stories go? I mean...
And the book is still in print.
And you can still get your hands on a Nat Tate?
Well, there aren't any circulating, but there's another little story. One of the documentaries we did about the life of Nat Tate, the producer said, could you knock up a Nat Tate for me on camera? So I said, sure. So I did a quick scribble of a Nat Tate bridge, and then he said, could I have it? I said, yeah, you can have it. Cut to, I think last year or the year before, Sotheby's, again, rings me up and says, somebody's trying to sell a Nat Tate. Can you authenticate it? So of course I did, and gave it a title, bridge number 122 or something like that. And it was sold at auction for another $3,000. I mean, it's not nearly as good as the one that Ant bought, but there's obviously a lot of, there's this intrinsic value in a Nat Tate. So maybe that's my old age pension sorted.
Oh my gosh, I can't believe it's still going. I didn't know the last. Sticking with humour, it's, I think, very important to you, and it's all weaves its way all the way through this novel, particularly because while it is a serious spy novel, you definitely seem to be poking some fun at the life of spies and sort of slightly deconstructing what it's all about.
Well, I think it's just, again, it's the nature of the kind of writer I am, because I would describe myself as a serious comic writer, and I can't write, deadly serious po-faced novels because I'm just not built that way. So in every novel I write, there is always some kind of absurdist black humor, because the world is a curious place, and as Vladimir Nabokov said, a good laugh is the best pesticide. And so I see the world through a comic lens, not a tragic lens. And that shapes the way I write. And I'm unaware of it, actually, but somebody said to me, it's very funny, this book. And I said, oh, yes, I suppose there are a few laughs in it. But it's part of the nature of the kind of novels I write. There'll always be an element of humor or comedy in them.
I can definitely sort of hear you chuckling to yourself. There's an escapade with a mouse, for example, that I'm sure was...
Well, that's highly symbolic. Yes.
Highly symbolic, but and I'm not going to give away the end. We won't give away that. No. But what about when you're also sort of poking gentle fun at your character's prose as a writer? So, for example, there's a scene... I don't want to give away too much about anyone in this novel, because you don't want to reveal your careful revelations, but one of the characters is mocking Gabriel for his prose that she says is lush and over the top, and talks of travel writing. A particular bit he writes, as I walked in the honeyed half darkness of dusk trees, leant into me and whispered, stay, stay, stay. Who are you mocking with that?
Well, I'm actually mocking a writer who who's dead, luckily, Lawrence Durrell, who I've written an introduction to one of the Alexandria Quartet books, so I had to reread Lawrence Durrell. And I actually met Lawrence Durrell once in the early 1980s, but he was quite, unself-conscious about it. He said, I can churn this stuff out by the yard.
That's what Gabriel says.
I
know.
Exactly. And if you pick up he's a travel writer, great travel writer as well, but if you pick up Lawrence Durrell, you come across these passages, that's the one you've just read. And Durrell used to say, you have to give it the full plum pudding, he said. And so he did. And actually, so I'm sort of gently poking fun at this tendency of not just travel writing, but writing about nature to get a little bit high cheekboned and get a bit over the top about how the sun rising over the dewy lawn, etc., etc. So it's a bit of fun and a bit of literary in-joke, but and I do reference Durrell. So people will get the joke.
Yes, yeah, so you weave other writers in all the time. I also love the way Gabriel is always coming up with things. What cannot be avoided must be accepted. Who says that, he asks. And then there's a quote about memory and self-pity, the most indulgent of human emotions. Someone had written, who said that? And you list the writers it could be. What do you...
Well, he's a writer, Gabriel, sort of self-taught and an intelligent man. And so it's that when he, as it were, refers to something he's read, or he tries to remember who said it. And so it's a way of just introducing his nature and sort of seeding the book with references that elevate it, perhaps, to a certain extent, and make you laugh. Again, it's a natural human trait.
Yeah.
Was it Shakespeare or was it Keats? You can never quite remember. And so it's just a tick he has.
And the sort of way he travels all around. As obviously he's a travel writer, and because he's sent on these missions. And again, the psychiatrist tells him he has wanderlust. And I wonder if that is a kind of in the world of William Boyd,
his love of travel and what travelling to new places brings?
Well, I don't think I'm a great... I have traveled a lot because I was born in Africa and I grew up in Ghana and Nigeria. So I was traveling, from a very early age. And, I travel like everybody else. I go on holiday. But again, the writing life takes you all over the place as well, on book tours. So I am quite well traveled, but I'm not an intrepid traveler. So I don't want to go anywhere too dangerous or too uncomfortable. So I wouldn't say I have wanderlust or I'm like Gabriel in that sense. I enjoy traveling and enjoy seeing new places, but I must say old Europe is still full of charms for me. I'm not the upper reaches of the Amazon. Too late for that now, I think. But so I'd happily go to Copenhagen for 3 days or back to Venice yet again. But I'm not a traveller in the sort of true literary sense of the word.
So in terms of researching a book like this, do you go back to those places? Do you bring Rome and Madrid and Cadiz and all these places from memory, or how do you?
Well, I often sometimes send my imagination. Because the book's set in 1961, 62, the places that Gabriel goes, Cadiz, Madrid, Warsaw, Southwold, are very different now. So in a way, there's not much point in going. I wrote an entire novel called The Blue Afternoon, set in the Philippines. But set in the Philippines in 1902. And I was going to go to the Philippines to research it, but I think some enormous volcano erupted and all flights were cancelled, so I thought, well, I'll just send my imagination. So I wrote this book, and it's a love story, and it's also about the American-Filipino War, which is one of these forgotten wars of history, kind of pre-Vietnam, before Vietnam. I wrote this book, and I got a letter from the head of the advertising agency, J. Walter Thompson, in Manila. And he said, "Dear Mr. Boyd, I'd like to congratulate you on your novel. And I'd like you to know that every time we get a new client at J. Walter Thompson, Manila, we give them a copy of your book to tell them something about the history of our beautiful country. When did you live in Manila, and how long did you stay there?" No higher compliment, so you really don't need to go anywhere. And in fact, in this, I was going to go to Warsaw, but I didn't go to Warsaw. But it's, I think, a very real Warsaw nonetheless.
I mean, it very much is. And as you say, interestingly, you're writing about a very different Warsaw to the one you would have seen and travelled in if you'd gone now. Why does that create such a good setting for you? What's the excitement about the 60s and when you're writing it then?
Well, I was alive in the 60s, and I remember the 60s. They coincide pretty much with my teenage years, and I have vivid memories of the time. But I think there's another reason that I like writing about the recent past, is that in a way, the novel doesn't date, because it's all the details in it and what happened are fixed. Whereas if you write a novel today and you put in something like the winner of I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here was, then within 5 years or so, nobody will know what you're talking about. A friend of mine wrote a novel which centers around a try scored at Twickenham during a rugby match by Will Carling. Anybody remember Will Carling? You need a footnote now, I think, for anybody under the age of 40. But the novel, which was contemporary, was dated by the fact it had such contemporary detail in it. And so I quite like to go back in time a bit to avoid that problem, that need to be absolutely contemporary, full of relevance to the world we're actually living in now, because in a year or 2 years' time, what you thought was important or significant isn't. So it's a pragmatic decision, but also from the point of view of a spy novel. The wonderful thing about setting it in the 60s is there are no mobile phones, there's no internet, there's no GPS. It's analog spying. And if you want to make a phone call, you can go to a phone box. And so all that stuff of the modern world isn't there, obviously. And it's liberating to imagine what that world was like. It seems inconceivable to anybody under the age of 40 that we existed without smartphones. But it just gives it a kind of, again, a sort of texture of its time and place.
Yeah. It's interesting, that idea of how far you have to go back then to make it relevant to a reader. I think I've heard you saying you wouldn't set a novel in, for example, the pandemic for that reason.
Yes, I think that I wouldn't write, I have written contemporary novels, but I take enormous care not to put in anything that will date the novel. Like a newspaper headline or mentioning a real-life politician, or even types of cars or television programs. So a novel I've written, like Ordinary Thunderstorms, which is a London novel, you won't find anything in it that can say that novel is set in 2015. So that you can read it now and it seems absolutely contemporary because there's no reference to the actual moment when it was written. So I don't sort of avoid the contemporary scene in my novel, in some of my novels, but I do take pains not to be able to have that year of composition identified. But I think again, the past, everything is fixed, and I'm seeing going further. The novel I wrote before this one, called The Romantic, is a whole life novel, but it spans the 19th century. That's the most historical novel I've written. I've got plans for another one. But it's just, it's because there's nothing shifting and there's nothing unsure about the past that suits my purpose as a novelist.
Do you ever not have plans for another one? Do you ever give yourself time off?
No. I always have at least 3 ideas for my next novel. Just because I want to avoid writer's block. And I can't think of anything worse than thinking, right, what shall I do? What shall I write about? Nothing. It must be, I have a very, very eminent novelist friend who had a writer's block for 7 years. And it's a terrible, terrible affliction. But to avoid that, I always have, when I get an idea for a novel, I write it down in a notebook. And then when I finish a novel, I can look at the various ideas I have, and one of them will seize me. One of them will slowly, like the cuckoo in the nest, kick the other fledglings out, and that will be the novel I write. In this case of this novel, the problem's been taken out of my hands because 2 sequels have already been commissioned.
Ah, really?
So Gabriel Dax lives on, but I'm quite pleased about that. It keeps me busy, and it's quite interesting to. I've never written a sequel of a novel. I've written short stories and sequences, but never a novel. But I think because of the nature of the spy novel, it, in a way, is almost crying out for a sequel.
How does that work? When you always know the end, don't you? You always know the ending of your novel before you begin. Is that
Yes,
right?
I think it's just advice I give to young writers. And it's the way I write is I plan the novel in great detail before I start on page 1. And I always know how it's going to end before I start at the beginning. And so I have a destination, which means I'm writing towards that destination. I don't write particularly quickly, but I write with confidence as a result of that. And sometimes I've actually written the final paragraph of the novel before I started page 1, because I know exactly what cadence or tone I want at the end, and because I've figured out what the end will be, I can write it and rewrite it almost before I start. But that's just my method. Some writers just start writing and hope the muse visits them every day. What if she doesn't? That's my point. But it's not for everyone. But it's Iris Murdoch used to write like this, and she used to refer to a period of invention and a period of composition, and that's very much the way there's a period of invention which can be as long as or longer than the period of composition. And I do make changes if I get a good idea halfway through, but it allows me this feeling of confidence as every day you sit down to write. I'm in the middle of chapter 22. I know exactly what's going to happen. so I write it.
And if we, as I understand it, come into the world of William Boyd's writing, you write between lunch and cocktail hour.
Yes, my metabolism starts firing after lunch. I'm not a lark. I'm a night owl, and I can only write for about 3 hours. I find I used to be able to write for 8 hours or longer, but as I got older, I find I'm sort of exhausted mentally after 3 hours of writing fiction. So 3 o'clock to 7, Channel 4 News. That's my period, and then you can break for a glass of wine and think about what you're going to write the next day. But it's just there's a real doggedness about writing a novel, but writing any long book, I suppose, that you can't just do it when you feel like it. You have to do it every day, and even if it's not very good, you can cross it out and start again. Yeah. But it's that relentlessness of writing. I say to people, if you want to be a novelist, you need certain things. You need to be able to write, obviously, and convey what you want your reader to understand. It's very good to have a well-functioning imagination as well. And you need to have stamina, which is often forgotten about because it just takes so long. You can't do it in 6 weeks, or you can. Some people can, but it's hard, dogged work in the main.
Yeah, but I was interviewing a gentleman called Oliver Berkman last week, and he said that actually 3 hours that you were mentioning, or 4 hours, is the absolutely perfect amount of time for creativity, and that all the greatest writers of the past wrote sort of, between 9 and 12 and 9 and 1 and then clocked off. So you're obviously doing the right thing.
Well, I think it's nature in a way. When I was starting to write, I seemed to have unbelievable reserves of energy. I mean, I was writing novels, I was writing a doctorate, I was writing a TV column for the New Statesman. I seemed to be able to do all that in my stride. Whereas now, as I say, brain fag sets in after 3 hours and, just about managed to open a bottle of wine. But it's just, it's just the aging process, I think. But I still can manage my 3 hours a day.
And you do obviously manage it because you keep producing brilliant novels. Is there a pressure in that, though? Because, people are always writing, everyone he delivers, and I'm loving it, engaging Peter James and all the people on the back who gobble up your novels. And I just wonder if there's a pressure in that continuation.
Well, yes, of course. I mean, you got to keep the show on the road somehow, and so every novel is another challenge, and you hope that what you want to write will please your readers, because I believe there's a sort of unspoken contract between reader and writer in the sense that the reader will part with his or her money for this book and wants something in return, and that's usually pleasure or something shocking or something interesting, something funny, something touching. So I think this is why I'm a realistic novelist, and I'm a very strong believer in narrative, and that urge to make the reader turn the page to find out what happens next is not one to be sniffed at, in my opinion. And so that's why that's the challenge for me each time I start a novel, to write that kind of book, however serious it is or however wide-ranging it is. It's still I still feel I have to satisfy that unspoken contract. That's what I want as a reader myself. Buy a book and read it. And if I'm not enjoying it, I'll stop reading it and won't buy that author's work again. So there's that feeling I have anyway, that I can't take my readership for granted.
And that interaction with your reader is the most important thing, as it should be. And I've heard you say before that in the past you bothered with reading the reviews, and now you just don't do that.
No,
much.
I read every review.
Oh, you do?
Good, bad, and indifferent, and I adjust my shit list accordingly. But I'm a forgive me. But I'm a critic myself. I've always written journalism even before I was published, and so I still review books, and I've dished it out myself, so I can hardly complain if I get a bit of a spanking now and then. But the thing about criticism, and I know this speaking as a critic, is it's very ephemeral. even though it may upset you deeply. That old line, a bad review might spoil your breakfast, but it shouldn't affect your lunch, is very true. And one of my favorite authors, Chekhov, said, and I paraphrase it, critics have been reviewing my work for 25 years, and not one of them has said anything of any use or interest, except one who said, I would die in a ditch drunk. And that's sort of how I feel about it.
Okay, well, that is a perfect place for me to shut up and hand over to you for questions. We'll go straight to the front, and then if there's a gentleman there, a lady there in the back row, and perfect, yeah.
William, I love the romantic, and especially your scene with the Battle of Waterloo. I've written a book about the Battle of Waterloo. I was sort of nerve-wracked that I was going to be pedantic about it, but you got it so historically accurate. It was tremendously impressive. How much time do you work on the historical research for your books?
Well, I did do a lot of work on the Battle of Waterloo because I knew that somebody like you was going to pull me up if I got things wrong. So I read enormously around it, but it was kind of the hero, Cashel Ross, arrives at Waterloo, but he sees the battle, but he doesn't actually participate in it. But it's almost, it was a kind of nod to another of my favorite writers, Stendhal, who in the Charterhouse of Parma wrote a very, very famous scene about the Battle of Waterloo. And because the Romantic covers the Romantic era, I sort of felt I had to get my hero to Waterloo at some stage. But I have got a stack of books, including yours, on the Battle of Waterloo. But it's so different from, you're a historian, I'm a novelist. The novelist has a wonderful sort of magpie instinct. You just look for something that catches your eye, and then you can stick it in your novel. You don't have to be precise and be accurate. So it's when you're researching a subject that's a historical subject, you can pick and choose in a way you can't if you're writing history. So I picked and chose my Battle of Waterloo scene, but I did scour many a book in the process.
When you look at a picture of William doing a Zoom interview, there's just books, waving towers of books because he reads
out of control, I'm afraid.
Do you have a mic there? I think there was a lady just there, and then we'll come to you afterwards.
For a very interesting and funny interview. You made me think about I'm either cursed or blessed with a very dry sense of humour. So I've been sort of reflecting on some of the other novelists other than yourself who made me laugh. For example, Douglas Adams, Ben Arovich, David Lodge. Who makes you laugh as a novelist?
Good question. I mean, when I always liked Evelyn Waugh in particular, and I think his comedies are his masterworks rather than the more famous Brideshead Revisited and A Handful of Dust, the Sword of Honour trilogy. I think Waugh's comic voice is extraordinary, and I've adapted his novel Scoop for a television film back in the 80s, and I think Scoop is almost as perfect a comic novel as you can imagine. It delivers on every front, and in a way it's a shame that Waugh didn't carry on as a comic novelist. I also like Muriel Spark, who I think is very funny, and actually Anton Chekhov as well should be played for laughs, I think. There's no one particular writer. Kingsley Amis, Martin Amis, there's Beryl Bainbridge. There's lots of writers who write comedy or comic novels or see the world through a comic lens, but I don't have any particular favorite. But I have written a lot about Waugh, and I've championed those comic novels, so perhaps he's the one that most influenced me, particularly when I was a young writer, because his comedy is, the thing that's about Waugh's comedy is that it's utterly ruthless, and that's what makes it shocking as well as funny. And that was, I think, his particular trademark, which he, I think, borrowed or lifted from another completely forgotten English writer who's also very funny called William Gerhardi, who was a famous young writer in the 1920s, and Waugh said, "I have talent, but you have genius," which is quite a compliment to pay to another writer. But Gerhardi is very funny as well. So it's that sort of black humour that I respond to, that sort of ruthlessness, and I think that's what I learned from Waugh.
Yes, a gentleman there.
Thank you. William, can I ask you a question about your gimlet eye? Not specifically, but and you'll hit at me, I asked ChatGPT to write 1,000 words in the style of William Boyd, and it was awful. So you can rest assured there. But it's about self-criticism and about how, of the many books that you've written, with the passage of time, with the benefit of hindsight, is there a book which, I hesitate, you're disappointed with, but a book which, with the passage of time, you perhaps see differently, and perhaps you might have written differently? And also, how's that changed? Do you have different favourites? Do you reread your books, like some film stars say they never watch their films? Do you reread your books, and what's your perspective on that?
I do reread my books, but usually when I'm adapting them for television or film, I occasionally pick one up and read a page or two to remind myself that how the hell did I write that? But because of my method of writing, because of this period of invention, period of composition, all my novels have turned out pretty much as I wanted them to be. So it may sound a bit vainglorious, but there are no runts in my litter. Whereas many a novelist will disown a book that they're disappointed with, or that somehow didn't come off in the way they wanted. But I wouldn't have started writing the novel if I wasn't absolutely happy with the shape I had invented for it. So I can look back at all my books and with fondness, but readers have different ideas. Readers have favorites and like some and dislike others. But I like them all, actually, and I can remember their composition. I can remember what went into the writing of them, and I don't think there's any one that I would disown, actually. Not even my James Bond novel, which I'm very proud of.
Yes, there's a gentleman there. Anyone else?
Thank you for a fascinating discussion. I'm curious, you talked about having multiple ideas for books ongoing at any point in time. Is there a stage during the period of invention or the period of composition where you lose some enthusiasm and you decide to revert to a different idea?
No, that's never happened. I've never abandoned a novel either. Again, I think it's to do with the way this method I have of thinking it through before I start writing. In a way, it allows me to make all my mistakes without having a word on the page. I can go up narrative blind alleys and turn back again, or drop a character because I can sense that character is not working. So those decisions that might have marred the book are taken before the book is written. And so I write on, as I say, with confidence. And I do change the narrative I've envisaged while I'm writing if I get a better idea, if I can reshape the book to accommodate it. I wrote a novel called Stars and Bars, which is a comedy, and it's about an Englishman in America who's trying desperately not to be English and wants to be an American. And I put in, he drives down to the Deep South. He's an auctioneer. He drives down to the Deep South to evaluate some crazy millionaire's art collection. And I thought that while he was on this journey south, he would go with a particularly obnoxious young woman. And this was a nod to Nabokov's book Lolita, which is, of course, about a car journey with a nymphette, in fact. So I inverted that. Instead of my hero fancying the nymphette, he absolutely detests her because she's driving him mad. Got to the end of this chapter, and I thought, no, she's got to stay in the novel. And sure enough, she does. But that's a sort of decision that had a knock-on effect for the rest of the narrative. But I'm not impeded or imprisoned by my method. I can make big changes and revisions and cut things out. But broadly speaking, the novel that is presented to the reader is the one that I wanted to write.
Anyone else got a question? Very rare and wonderful opportunity to ask a question of William Boyd. Yes.
Listening to your method, artists sometimes have more than one canvas on the go. Do you ever have more than one book on the go, given the method you've spoken about?
Not another book, but I will write, screenplays. I write short stories. I write journalism while I'm writing a novel. But I couldn't switch from one novel to another novel. I have to write the one that I'm writing and then write another one. But I'm not, I don't sort of cut myself off from other forms of writing. And the thing about the film business is that you can write a script, 3 years later, suddenly somebody else comes on board and they want it revised. So I'm happy to do all that sort of thing, but step away from the novel, as it were, switch off the novel bit of my brain and re-engage the journalism bit or the short story bit. So I do other forms of writing. It's interesting talking about chat, GPT. I asked a question of it to see if it was any good. So I wrote this film script where somebody had to feign their death. Now, it's incredibly difficult to do that in the modern world with DNA, etc., etc. It's incredibly difficult. But I came up with this brilliant idea of how you could do it. So I asked the chat, how do you feign your death? And the answer came back, this is an illegal question. That was just then I said, all right, how do you feign your death in a story? This is a very difficult thing to achieve. So utterly useless as far as I was concerned. So I'll stick to my own brain. Thank you very much.
You should have been in the AI chat yesterday. We could probably sneak in, yes, one quick more question.
Very interesting to hear about your technique for writing novels. Does your technique for writing screenplays follow the same pattern, or do you have very different considerations there?
Well, it would depend if it was an original screenplay or an adaptation. I think if it's an original screenplay, the same method works very well. But I would say at least 75% of all films are adaptations of some kind, and it's a totally different set of mental gears that you engage when you take a book or a short story or a newspaper article and try to construct a film out of it. And that's when you think, what can this be done on screen? And that simple question usually tells you yes or no, and that determines how you adapt the book. It's more of a craft, it seems to me, than an art, adapting a book for cinema. But original screenplays are, like writing short stories in the sense that they don't take that long, but you're caught in the parameters of the art form, so it very much determines what you write. But I think same method: think it through, research it. How is it going to end? What's your final scene? And then start writing.
I'm sorry if we didn't get to your question. I think there's a couple over there, but William's going to be signing, aren't you, the
Yes.
book, so you could possibly sneak in and ask him then, but I don't want to upset the very tight-running Cliveden ship of timings. I said at the beginning, a wonderful storyteller. I'm sure you'll all very much agree after that. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.